This is Get Real with Deb Waterbury, a show where Dr. Deb gets real as she teaches through books and studies on topics relevant for today. And now, here is your host, Dr. Deb Waterbury.
Hello there. Welcome to this episode of Get Real with Deb Waterbury. I'm really excited. We are on book 3 of our series on the Painted Window trilogy. The last book is called White Zephyr. This is book 3. We've already done book 2, which is Threads, and book 1, which was Painted Window. And if you haven't seen the ones prior to this, like you're just joining us now, I highly encourage you, because this is a trilogy. And in a trilogy, there are characters that begin and you take the story all the way through. Now, this will stand on its own. I was sure to write it in a way that you could just read White Zephyr and kind of catch up by reading the first parts, but you'll get a whole lot more out of it if you get the entire trilogy. And you can get any of them, one or all of them, at debwaterbury.com. That's also the place where you'll be able to see all of the lessons from Painted Window and Threads. Each one of these has been an 8-lesson series, and we're just beginning on White Zephyr. And so for those of you who have joined us, or if you're just new joining us here for this series, you know that this series is about a woman named Elizabeth and her friends. There turns out to be 12 of them. And they live in the land of Camdenshire. This is an allegory, so everything allegorically represents something else higher. And obviously we're talking about the kingdom of heaven, both here on earth as we wait to go with our Savior, and then heaven itself. And so Elizabeth and her friends are now living in Camdenshire, and the King Reginald, who is symbolic for Jesus, has been called away. And we saw that happen in the second book. First book was about understanding that you are chosen by the King of Kings and coming to grips with that kind of love. The second book is when he actually is called away, as we know that he ascended. Well, King Reginald is called away to war. And so the second book is really learning how to live here on this earth when we don't have our King right here with us. How do we remember that we're loved that way? How do we move in the truths of the word when he's not physically here with us? So that's really book 2. Book 3 is got our friends now, and they've kind of, at the end of book 2, they really make this resolute promise, because Camdenshire itself is falling apart. And there's much of this you're going to recognize just in our world right now as Jesus, as time gets closer and closer for him to come, the world seems to get more and more undone. Well, Camdenshire does that. The longer King Reginald is away, the more undone Camdenshire becomes. And so these very avid, devout followers, this remnant of followers after King Reginald, now knows it's their job to remind the citizens of Camdenshire that King Reginald will come back, that he is coming back, even though the forces of darkness that we know is mostly represented by Humphrey in the books is trying his hardest to derail everybody. So there's still a whole lot of stuff happening in the book. You'll see this as we go. It'll be the introduction of what we call the Holy Spirit, which is the White Zephyr, this wind that comes through and really enables them, speaks to their hearts. Everything in these books stands for something biblical. And so White Zephyr takes us all the way to the end when the King does return. So as we start this first section, part 1, you'll recognize that we have a lot of stuff that is about Millie in the first couple of chapters. And you'll remember poor Millie. Millie was the one in the beginning of the trilogy who is just wanting something better. She's the one who fell prey to Jamison's miracle oil. And in Threads, she fell prey to Caelan Lancaster, the guy who was trying to, entice her by money and jewels and stuff to do the things that he wanted her to do. So Millie is just always looking for something better. And either you are that person, you have been that person, or you know that person. That we all go through that at some point. So the first couple of chapters here is really talking about Millie. But what I hope you notice about all of the characters, even as we're getting started, is they all have an opportunity and do somewhat fall from grace. There is no guarantees. And as a matter of fact, all of us are going to run into that place in our lives where we fall from grace, where we make mistakes, where we choose incorrectly. It is the nature of living in this fallen earth. And even as believers who have been, and are people of eternity, even those people will continually and unfortunately choose the wrong thing sometimes. And you know what I love about the Bible, what I love about what God did, was that he let us see his servants in all of that. Do you know what I mean? In their good stuff and in their bad stuff. And there's so much we can learn from that. And I believe that David is probably one of the best examples of that in the Bible. And it's so wonderful that this is a man described as a man after God's own heart. Like literally, he was the one that the Bible says ran after God more than just about anybody else. And yet David is also our example of one of the people in the Bible that sinned just about in every way imaginable. He's a good example of both what we know is of our character, but what we also know is the redemption of our Lord. So for the next couple of weeks, for this week and the next study, part 2, I really want to talk about David. And I am going to talk about what we read in 2 Samuel chapter 11, beginning there with his fall from grace with Bathsheba. And that is probably the most well-known sin of David's, but I want to make sure that we look at this not so that it's not that looky-loo thing, when there's a car wreck on the side of the road and you just can't look away because you want to see whatever, and we seem to just can't look away from tragedy. So I don't want us to revel in this great man of God who falls so far. But there is so much for us to learn, not the least of which is that sin kind of cascades. There's, you don't just usually commit one. It's like Lay's potato chips. You can't just eat one. There's a whole bunch of them coming right afterwards because it just kind of does that. That's what sin does. And it did that with David. We just have to be careful, though, that we're looking at his sin and his fall, not to revel in this fall of a man of God, but to understand that we all both can do it and that we all can be saved from it. A.W. Pink said this about our looking at these sins. He said, "Now the sins of God's servants are recorded for our instruction, not for us to shelter behind or use for palliating our own offenses, but for us to lay to heart and seek with all our might to avoid." And I know we often look at that tragic page in David's life, and like I said, that we think that there's just that one sin, but there's always another one close on its heels. Pink also said, "Sin is insatiable. It is never satisfied. Its nature is to drag us lower and lower, getting more and more daring in its opposition to God." You just start small, and then it just seems to get bigger and bigger, that snowball going down the hill. And this was true of David. So as I said, we're going to be in 2 Samuel chapter 11, looking at a few verses there, and I'll do the first part of this lesson. The next part will be next lesson, talking about this. And I'm going to end this in our next lesson with some questions about sin and Christians and sin. And I think they're questions that I've heard often and been asked often in my office. So I want to end this lesson next week with answering those questions. But let's start with David. So David, then, we know his fall is kind of begun to speak about in 2 Samuel chapter 11. We'll look first at the first verse and just kind of talk about what it was that David was ignoring, where he put himself so that sin became just an easy thing to do. So 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1, I'll be reading from the English Standard Version, and it reads this way. "In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained at Jerusalem." Now David, as we can read in the chapter before, was at war with the Ammonites because they had insulted him in certain ways, and so now he's at war with them, and he, at this point, the time of, there's a war happened during this time seasonally, because there were times when you just couldn't. It was too cold, too rainy, too muddy, too whatever. So it was as interesting as it sounds. There were times of year that kings went to war. If they'd pick out who they needed to defeat, and then there was a time of year for that. So when it says this was a time of year when kings went to war. So they would wait to go to war in that springtime, which is what we see happening in verse 1. And it's spring in all of Israel. Make sure to say that all of Israel is going out to finish the job that they had started whenever they had first gone to war with the Ammonites earlier, and by besieging the capital of Rabbah. But notice that David didn't go. And this is very significant because during this time period, every man who is able to go to war is to go to war. And they are to be led by their king. That's the way typically it's supposed to go. But David makes the decision that he's not going to go. And this becomes extremely detrimental. I mean, because the one thing, David, there's a lot of reasons for him saying he doesn't want to go, but you can read in First Chronicles, the passage when he takes the census he wasn't supposed to take. He took that when he was at home. It was during this time. He was supposed to be at war, but he's walking around his kingdom and going, I just need to see how good I am. I got all these people. Let's count them. Let's count how many people we got. And that's exactly what he tells them to do. It was that sin of boredom that then was like, let me just look at all that I have, that then moves into pride. And that was the sin of the census. I know some people have a hard time wondering why God was so hard on David for counting the people. It wasn't about the act of counting. It was the heart that did the act of counting. And had David been where he should have been, at war with his men, he wouldn't have been at home just wandering around looking at all that he had, thinking he was all that in a bag of chips. And even at the point where when Joab later on, this whole war happens, Joab had to go send for David when they won. He was like, David, you best come over here because we won, and if you're not here, the people are going to say I did it. So David ran out there, and whenever they rode the one ride of success, David led the ride of success as if he had won, so that he could take credit for the success. Otherwise, Joab was going to get it. So, there's a lot to be seen here about David. David is a lot of acting. At this point, it seems to me that he's acting like Saul. He didn't go to war. He didn't do the things he needed to do. Remember whenever David went out and fought Goliath? Saul was the one who was supposed to be out there. Saul was back in his little, letting other people do it. David's acting a whole lot like Saul right now. And he's probably bored at this point with that fight, because this whole siege on the Ammonites at the capital city, Rabbah, took a long time. It was basically hurry up and wait. They're just waiting outside of the city gates of Rabbah till these people just pretty much starve to death, and then the war will be over. He's bored. He figures it's not a place for a king. I'm just going to go home and hang out. And, David is, I guess at this point, you could probably just say he's becoming soft. He's a lot like Saul. David preferred the luxury of his bed than being out in under the tents with his men. So, and he left it all to Joab. And this is the very man that he distanced himself from later on for being so violent. But he's willing to let Joab take care of this as long as he doesn't have to go. So David then, we see, is lazy. If you look at the next verse, this is verse 2 of 2 Samuel chapter 11. It happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house, that he saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. Okay, so we know David's not supposed to be there. Now Bathsheba is the woman on the roof. As far as she's concerned, nobody's here. Now the king's house would have been, for military reasons, on the highest point of the city. So if it's on the highest point and he's at the highest point of the house on the roof, he can look down on everybody else. Now, as far as the people are concerned, there's nobody in the palace. David should be at war. So Bathsheba, and you always bathed on the roof, that's where you took your bath, would have assumed there was nobody to be able to see her on her roof. So I think, even when I was growing up, I remember hearing these stories and thinking that Bathsheba was trying to entice him. She was just taking a darn bath and thinking that nobody was going to be looking. David was the one, bored, walking around his roof, surveying his land, this is pre-census taking, so he's looking about, figuring out who he can count. His eyes land on Bathsheba. So he's strolling around. We know this. And he hasn't sinned specifically yet. But as I said, and we know it starts in the mind. He sees her. She's really pretty. So he goes and he inquires about her. And when he inquires about her, he finds out, and we can see this in verses 2 through 4. Let me go ahead and read them, actually, the same chapter. And the woman was very beautiful, and David sent and inquired about the woman. And one said, "Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" So David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she had been purifying herself from her uncleanness. Then she returned to her house. Okay, so David basically says, that girl's really pretty. I see her over there bathing. Who is that exactly? Well, it's not like he can't know now because somebody told him she's married to Uriah. And he would have recognized the name Uriah. Uriah was a great warrior in his armies fighting the battle he refused to go to. And so when it says that he went and sent some to take her, she did not go voluntarily, but understand that no one could come against the king. That would be certain death. So When the king summons you, you go. Now, why do you think that the Bible, that the writer, and it makes it a point here to say that she was purifying herself from her uncleanness? Well, the reason is because she's about to get pregnant, and the writer needed you to recognize this was David's baby. There was no way it could have been anybody else's. Her husband was away, and she had just finished with her menstrual cycle. So she was not pregnant at the time that David took her. There needed to be, according to biblical accounts, no question as to the fact of whose baby this is. So, we have to recognize again this cascade of sins has begun, and understanding too that sin always takes place in our minds first, and we have to take those thoughts captive. So moving on then, his sin, he sees something he wants, he goes after it. That sin is, there's a planning phase in sin. It says the woman was very beautiful, he's planning this out, and there is that planning phase of what a sin does. So Bathsheba probably would have reasoned, like I said, there wasn't anybody there. But notice again in the verse, and actually I talked about that, the verse in verse 5 where it says she was doing her menstrual cycle cleansing. Now, I think that the most important part that we see here about that is, again, David is setting himself up. David is the king, and we do this often. We think it's, I need a break. I deserve a break. And David had decided he deserved a break. He was a king. And I want to speak to this just for a second before I close here, because I've kind of set the stage for this. When it says he took her, it means he had sex with her, and then he sent her away. We'll find that out next time. But I want to talk a minute to the sin of taking a break. Not that it's a sin to take a break. I should rephrase that. But what we often do, especially in this world, and I just addressed this with my clients the other day, we have this tendency to think that self deserves a break. Self has had a hard time. And I love the phrase self-care. I haven't had any self-care. I even have a client who comes to me and says, I'm her self-care. I have an issue with that phrase, because I don't need to make time for self-care. I am all about self. Everything I do is about self. And to say that I deserve a break, yes, you do. But do you know what that break should be for the believer? Your break should be for more God time, because that's where you're going to get your sustenance. We need a break from the world. We don't need a break from God. But what we often do is say, I just need a break. I'm not going to go to church tonight. I don't want to go to church. I want to watch TV. I don't want to go on that mission trip because I'd really rather spend this on a car. I need a new car. I deserve that. We tend to think we need a break and not realize that what you actually need a break from is the world. You need a break from the world. You don't need a break from God. We should be running to Him, but we often find ourselves running away from Him under the guise of self-care, under the guise of I deserve this. And I'm as guilty as the next person. I feel like whenever I need a break, I need to be able to sit on the couch and watch TV for 10 hours and nobody bother me. That's my break. Well, that's not a break. That's a break from God. That's the break I need. I need to spend my break running toward God. So understand that when you do that, when you give yourself that kind of break, you're setting yourself up, because your eyes are off the prize, and you set yourself up for unfortunate sin or sinful behavior. And that's exactly what David did. It is important that you and I look at these characters in the Bible and we don't just see their lives as something to watch, like we're watching a good TV show. The Lord put His story here so that you and I could recognize our own propensities for cascading sin and where that comes from. It will come from spiritual laziness. It'll always come from spiritual laziness. So David's sins are cascading, and then we're going to go more into that next time. In the meantime, until I see you again, please take the break, but take the break toward God. Don't take it away from Him. God bless you. I'll see you next time. Thank you for joining me today on this episode of Get Real with Deb Waterbury. I hope you were blessed, and I hope you got some information that's going to help you get through your day. If you want any more information on any of my books or my articles or on any of my future speaking engagements, you can find all that information at debwaterbury.com. God bless you.